Let's do today's class. Um, so yeah, in the reading, the main reading was an academic publication, a journal article, which appeared in quite a well-known British British International Relations journal called International Affairs. I just kind of looked through the article again, and although, yeah, as I said, it is a little bit academic. I think it's reasonably sort of clear in terms of describing um, what NATO has been doing in the former Yugoslavia and in Afghanistan. Yeah, I don't know how you guys have found it, but I mean, reading it myself, I think it's perhaps slightly less difficult or slightly less technical than perhaps some other articles might be on this particular subject. But yeah, it's basically describing the various NATO operations in this area. Um, and yeah, in the first section, so PowerPoint here sort of paraphrases some of the main points in the article. First section talks a little bit about this notion of NATO in crisis, and one of the points, and I agree with the author's assessment on this. One of the points they make is that when you look at NATO's history, the organisation, we've talked about this before, but obviously founded in 1949, so pretty much at the beginning of the Cold War. When you look at NATO's history, the one thing that is apparent is that there have been sort of regular crises, or at least observers have believed that NATO has undergone, or sorry, experienced is probably a better word, that NATO has experienced several crises throughout its history. So almost as soon as the organization is created, there were kind of people talking about whether or not the organization could actually survive. So during the Cold War, for example, you have things like the Suez Crisis in 1956, when Britain and France intervene against Egypt, but the United States failed to support them. So the United States failed to support the intervention. So that was seen as quite a significant division between the Americans and the European allies. In the kind of 1960s, you have France withdrawing from NATO's military structures in 1966 under President de Gaulle. In the early détente years, the late 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, when you see a sort of relaxation in superpower tensions, again, people sort of question whether or not NATO is particularly necessary. And then, of course, you have the end of the Cold War. We've talked about this before, but the end of the Cold War, again, people were sort of asking the question of whether or not NATO was really needed. So yeah, as I say, throughout its history, there have been periodic crises, if I can put it that way, in NATO's history. People have sort of been talking about whether or not NATO as an institution could actually survive. So looking at my slide here in front of us, so it makes the point, first of all, the Cold War ends in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself disappears. Which basically leaves NATO, which is a military alliance, without an obvious external enemy. So again, people are sort of, and one of the things we discussed, one of the articles sort of discussed why eventually Western Europeans and the United States sort of agreed that NATO still had some kind of purpose, that NATO still had a job to do in terms of its involvement in the European security system. But again, early 1990s, again, as the second point on this slide says, there were various proposals that perhaps a different sort of security organization could, there were suggestions that a different security organization might actually be able to replace NATO as Europe's main security organization. One of them was the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. We've mentioned that before. And that organization came out of the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe. So this was sort of this institution was basically promoted to being a permanent international organization at the beginning of the 1990s. And it had certain advantages over NATO, not least being the fact that the OSCE was pan-European. So virtually all European countries, plus the United States and Canada, were members of this. So that was one argument in favor of replacing NATO with the OSCE. The other potential institution was the Western European Union, which again we've mentioned before when we talked about the 1990s. Western European Union was a sort of European security organization, which had close ties with the European Union. So it was a sort of beginnings, I suppose, of the European Union having its own sort of defence identity or own defence policy. It was the British in particular who were quite keen to promote, to use the Western European Union. Although the WEU was by its nature an organisation which was designed to sort of complement NATO as opposed to challenge it. So WEU was, from the beginning, was sort of hardwired to be subservient to NATO. WEU itself eventually disappears at the beginning of the 21st century and is replaced by the EU's own European security and defence policy. But essentially, there is this idea that third point on our PowerPoint is that despite all this discussion, NATO doesn't disappear and it retains its status as being the main. So despite all this discussion, despite the Cold War ending, for various reasons, again, we've talked about this before, but for various reasons, the European NATO members at the beginning of the 90s and the United States agree that NATO should actually continue. But there's also a recognition that its mission needs to change. It can no longer simply be an organization which is designed to sort of defend Western Europe from external attack. That's not enough. There's a sort of recognition that NATO's mission is going to have to change in some way. Beginning of the 1990s, you have the London Declaration, which talks about, among other things, it basically states very clearly that NATO no longer views the Soviet Union as a threat to European security. And I suppose this is the beginning of the discussions about how NATO's sort of mission should be changed. And one other thing, I can't remember if I've got this on the next slide. No, I don't. Okay, right, before we get on to Bosnia. But one of the areas of debate, I suppose, between the Americans and the Europeans is whether or not, or the degree to which NATO should be involved beyond Europe, or beyond, let's say, the sort of NATO area, so beyond those countries which were actually NATO members. And to simplify, I suppose, broadly speaking, during the 1990s, it's the Americans who are saying, actually, NATO needs to have, again, to use a bit of technical language, that NATO should have some kind of out-of-area capability. In other words, that NATO should be involved in some kind of overseas operations, so beyond the NATO area. That might include other European countries which were not NATO members, and again we'll get onto the Yugoslavia crisis in a moment, but also potentially North Africa and the Middle East as well. So it's the, as I say, it's the Americans who like the idea of NATO having some kind of out-of-area capability. Another, again, to use another slightly technical word, I'm not sure if it's the same word in Polish, I should have checked. But this idea that NATO should have some sort of expeditionary aspect. Okay, an expedition being sending soldiers, military forces overseas. Okay, sending them, to well beyond, beyond Europe. So this idea that NATO should have some kind of expeditionary capability. In contrast, many European countries, including, I think, to some extent, a country like Poland, which obviously becomes a member of the alliance at the end of the 1990s. But many European countries still wanted to retain the emphasis, say that NATO's main role should still be limited to defending, European countries from external attack. So there's less enthusiasm within Europe for the idea that NATO should have, as I say, some sort of expeditionary aspect to its mission, that NATO should be intervening overseas. So as I say, the Americans want NATO to have a greater out-of-area role. The Europeans a bit more, you could say a bit more reluctant or less enthusiastic about this idea. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Yugoslavia. So as we talked about this before, but as the Europeans are debating, as Europeans and also the Americans are sort of debating about what NATO's job should be, whether or not there should be, whether or not there should be some sort of out-of-area capability. You've got the collapse of Yugoslavia at the beginning of the 1990s. So in 1991, Slovenia and Croatia secede from the sort of Yugoslav Federation to become independent states. There's a very brief war with Slovenia, lasts about 10 days, but a much longer war involving the rump of Yugoslavia, which was mainly Serbia, and the newly independent Croatia. Then the following year, 1992, Bosnia also secedes from the Yugoslav Federation, so the war kind of widens to include Bosnia as well. And Bosnia was particularly difficult because it was very much a multi-ethnic society. Basically, Bosnia was a sort of patchwork, if I can put it that way. Bosnia sort of had lots and lots of different enclaves, some of which were Serbian dominated, so Bosnian Serbs, some which were Croat dominated, and some were Bosnian Muslim or Bosniak sort of dominated. So the war in Bosnia becomes very, very messy. Lots of fighting, lots of atrocities. So lots of people being killed, civilians being killed, meaning people non-military people being killed. And this becomes a sort of major European security problem. Okay, right, I'll move on to the next slide. Obviously, we've got a picture here. Here we've got obviously a soldier wearing a blue helmet. So that indicates, obviously, that this is a United Nations mission. So the soldier is part of a United Nations mission. And I don't say it on this slide. Okay. But yeah, one of the first I suppose, decisions when the war breaks out is that the United Nations does dispatch what becomes known as a UN protection force, so a military force is dispatched into the former Yugoslavia, I think mainly deployed in Bosnia. And it is mainly made up of European forces. So although it's a UN military sort of peacekeeping mission, the countries which contribute are mainly European. So it's basically mainly a European force, which is sort of dispatched at the beginning of the 1990s. Excuse me. Just having a mouthful of water. Okay. So the slide here. The war in Bosnia. So as I say, Bosnia kind of breaks away from Yugoslavia in 1992. And as I said, the war is particularly messy. And again, we mentioned this before when we talked a little bit about the sort of crises that Europeans are sort of facing in the 1990s. And one of the points we've made is, this is the first point on the slide here, that political divisions within Europe meant that NATO was unable. So basically what you see is, again, this is 92, so just before, it's after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, but just before the European Union is formally established. But nonetheless, there is this ambition, there is this desire on the part of the Europeans that there should be some kind of European common foreign and security policy. And you could argue that Yugoslavia is a sort of test case for the Europeans. Can they sort of manage the crisis? Can they formulate a common policy to try and sort of contain the crisis in Yugoslavia? And the answer to that question is no. That when it comes to it, the Europeans are, certainly in the early years, so we're talking about 91, 92, 93, the Europeans find it very difficult to formulate an effective policy or indeed a common policy. So as I say that, there are political divisions within Europe itself about how the Europeans should sort of manage the crisis. There's also divisions, I suppose, in terms of various European countries' historical associations with the various warring parties in Yugoslavia. So broadly speaking, the Germans have quite a strong connection with Croatia. The two countries have been allies during the Second World War. So the Germans were sort of relatively pro-Croatian in 1991 when Croatia breaks away. In contrast, countries like Britain and France, they had sort of closer connections with Serbia. And while I don't think they were necessarily pro-Serbian in this period, they were certainly more reluctant to come down too hard against Serbia in the early stages of the crisis. So as I say, political divisions make it quite hard for the Europeans to sort of come up with a coherent policy in these early years. So one of the points that forgotten their names. What are the names? I think it's Sperling, isn't it? Yeah, there's Sperling and Weber make in their article. They say basically NATO decision making is therefore ad hoc and reactive in the early years. Ad hoc basically meaning that they're having to make decisions, to use an English idiom, on the fly, meaning, you make decisions in a reactive way. You are responding to events rather than having a clear plan. You are just sort of making decisions from one moment to the next. Okay, so that's sort of ad hoc decision making. NATO decision making kind of ad hoc and reactive. So as I said, there isn't, a kind of very kind of coherent plan in terms of the way NATO responds to the crisis. And again, I'm cutting a long story short. I think we've talked about some of this already, the crisis in Yugoslavia. But for a while, there is deliberation about whether there should be some sort of military intervention to try and bring the war to an end. broadly speaking, I think the Americans, especially when Clinton becomes president, take the idea of military intervention more seriously than their European counterparts. The Europeans are reluctant to sort of send NATO military forces into Yugoslavia, not least because they actually have peacekeeping forces. The Europeans actually have soldiers on the ground in Yugoslavia, and that sort of becomes a problem. Because European countries are basically concerned or basically worried that perhaps their soldiers will be attacked or taken hostage, so captured or taken hostage or things like that. So as I say, Europeans really from 91, 92 through to 95, rather reluctant to sort of agree to some sort of direct military action to try and bring the war in Yugoslavia to an end. That finally comes to an end in 1995 when, for a variety of reasons, the Europeans finally agree that NATO will have to take some kind of military action. And what you see is NATO's first out-of-area operation. This is Operation Deliberate Force. So there is a brief bombing campaign. So NATO aircraft are used. As I say, it's for the first time in its history, NATO actually goes into combat. Okay, so NATO actually uses force. So it's NATO's first out-of-area operation. Obviously, Yugoslavia falls beyond sort of NATO members' territory. And it's NATO's first combat operation. And it's pretty successful. It does bring the war to an end. The intervention lasts, I think, about 48 hours. So it's a very brief military campaign. The Yugoslav government, what was left of Yugoslavia, which was basically mainly Serbia, but the Yugoslav government under Milosevic agrees to come to the negotiating table. All the various parties are flown out to an American air base in Dayton, Ohio. A peace agreement is drawn up, which eventually comes into force, and the war is brought to an end. So this is seen as, I suppose, a reasonably successful intervention. So having, the Europeans having failed to really manage the war effectively, finally NATO does come in 95, and as I say, there is a brief military intervention, which brings the war in Bosnia effectively to a conclusion. The final points at the bottom there, NATO basically used to enforce a United Nations Security Council resolution. So the intervention was legally authorized by the United Nations. And then after the war comes to an end, a NATO land force, the international force, IFOR, is eventually deployed in Bosnia on a sort of peacekeeping. So as I say, the war in Bosnia 95 is the first time NATO basically action. Okay, moving on. Kosovo then. So as I said, the article is primarily concerned about talking about crises, and whereas the intervention in Bosnia in 95 proceeds reasonably smoothly and it's reasonably effective. So NATO is broadly united in 1995. As I say, there is a UN Security Council, so the Russians and the Chinese sort of more or less accept the intervention. Maybe not that enthusiastic, but the intervention is sort of legally authorized. In contrast, the war against Kosovo, the intervention over Kosovo in 99 is much, much more difficult for NATO. Many kind of commentators at the time and since have described the war as a major as a major challenge for NATO, and even that NATO does sort of experience something close to an existential crisis during the war. Now, the article on that accompanies this class sort of acknowledges that, yeah, Kosovo is definitely a very, very difficult experience for NATO for a variety of reasons, which we will get onto. On the other hand, Sperling and Weber say it's important not to exaggerate. So, yeah, the experience is difficult, but all things concerned, when you look at how the operation sort of pans out, NATO kind of more or less comes through it intact, if I can put it that way. NATO certainly experiences problems, but they sort of argue that it's an exaggeration to say that NATO undergoes a sort of near-death experience or anything like that. So they think that perhaps talk of crisis during the Kosovo campaign is an exaggeration. Okay, let's look at some of the points. So I'm just going to have another sip of water, so just bear with me. Okay, thanks. Right, so looking at the slide here, so a number of points on this particular slide. Point number one. Clinton wanted to use the crisis to define NATO's purpose. Okay, so again, as I said, there's a sort of debate in the 1990s about why do we need NATO? What is NATO for? NATO obviously had already been used once to bring the war in Bosnia to an end in 1995. Now NATO is sort of facing another significant problem on its borders. Obviously, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia in the 1990s as well, on the frontiers of NATO. Obviously, Italy, a NATO member, bordered Yugoslavia. Should also be said, by 1999, NATO has got bigger. So you have the first NATO, the first post-Cold War NATO enlargement in 1999 brought in. East Central European countries are brought in, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. So NATO itself is sort of pushing further east. I think that's actually quite important when you look at how the dynamics of the crisis. I should say in passing that the Polish government at the time was quite pro-intervention. Okay, so the Polish government at the time did support the NATO intervention against Kosovo, more so in fact than both the Czech Republic and Hungary, which were perhaps less enthusiastic about the intervention. Back to the first point. Okay, so Clinton wanted to define the crisis. Yeah, 1999 was also, of course, the 50th anniversary of NATO's formation. So it was sort of NATO's birthday in 1999, and actually they sort of celebrate it right in the middle of the crisis. I think the North Atlantic Treaty, I forget the exact date, but it's signed April 1999. So NATO's literally celebrating its sort of 50th birthday right in the middle of, a major crisis. And it has been suggested that the anniversary sort of plays a role in the various decision makers' decisions to actually sort of intervene in Kosovo. Again, as I say, we're sort of back to the idea of NATO wanting to prove that it did actually have some kind of post-Cold War role to play. Okay, so you have Clinton in the White House, as I say, wanting to show that NATO was still useful, that it still could do a job. You've also got then Madeleine Albright, who was Clinton's Secretary of State. She was the first woman Secretary of State. Secretary of State, of course, being America's sort of foreign minister. So she was the lady responsible for American foreign policy. And she was, for various reasons, was very much a supporter of the idea of humanitarian intervention. So she did believe that states should use military force if there were situations where countries were going through some kind of humanitarian catastrophe. You also have Tony Blair as Britain's Prime Minister, and like Albright, he too was somebody who was a sort of passionate believer in intervention. Blair obviously still in office after 2001, so he was still Prime Minister after 2001, where you have the 9/11 attacks and the War on Terror. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But yeah, second point there, Albright and Blair wanting to bring the carnage in Bosnia. Oh, sorry, mistake there. Okay, that's a typing mistake. Should read, I'll try and change that. Amend that on the Microsoft Teams upload. Okay, yeah, so Blair and Albright wanted to bring the carnage in Kosovo, I should say, to an end, not Bosnia. Okay, so we're talking about Kosovo here, so sorry, that's a mistake. Carnage meaning the killing and the atrocities. So basically, I think towards the end of 1998, the situation in Kosovo is deteriorating. I should say, first of all, yeah, I mean, just to explain what was happening. Kosovo was part of Serbia itself. Okay, so it was like a province within Serbia. So Kosovo actually belonged to Serbia itself. But it was 90%, in terms of its population, its ethnic makeup, it was 90% Albanian. So sort of Muslim Albanian. So although it's part of Serbia, the Serbs themselves only accounted for 10% of the population. The other thing to say is that Kosovo historically was very, very important to Serbia. There's a big battle which the Serbs lose in Kosovo in the 14th century to the Ottoman Empire. So yeah, Kosovo, as I say, has a really has a really strong hold on Serbs. And what basically happens is that the situation within Kosovo sort of breaks down. In 1998, there's a mounting sort of political crisis. Serbian forces, security forces, start committing atrocities. They start kind of killing people. People are being driven from their homes. There's a very nasty massacre which is revealed to the world at the beginning of 1999. So there's sort of political pressure is sort of mounting for the West, for NATO to sort of intervene, which they finally do, as I say, in sort of beginning of 99. I haven't put this on the slide, but basically what happens is that the various parties, so the Serbian government, what was left of the Yugoslavian government, and the political representatives of the Kosovo Albanians are invited to a French chateau. A treaty is drawn up, which basically promises that Kosovo will be given autonomy, but it will still remain part of Yugoslavia, or part of Serbia. But Kosovo was going to be given autonomy, so some form of self-government, and that NATO would sort of give would turn Kosovo into a sort of protectorate. So NATO would sort of guarantee the security in the country. This time, the Yugoslav government rejects this, and as a consequence, NATO again intervenes. So this is the second sort of Yugoslav intervention that NATO undertakes at the end of the 1990s. But this time, yeah, the intervention does not go anything like as smoothly as the previous intervention in Bosnia in 95. So this conflict, as I say, is much more difficult. And as I say, various writers have talked about this idea of NATO experiencing this sort of crisis. Why was that? First and foremost, I think several reasons. Okay. First of all, NATO itself is very much divided on the desirability of the intervention. So there were several NATO countries which were deeply unhappy to begin with for the purpose of protecting Kosovo. Probably the two most prominent were Turkey and Greece, so two countries which, Greece obviously part of the Balkans, Turkey also, in close proximity. So the Turks and the Greeks between them were not very supportive of the intervention to begin with. There are other NATO countries which were also relatively unenthusiastic as well. So NATO from the outset was quite divided politically. And the problem in 99 is that, as I say there, the third point there, there's a crisis. The crisis sort of deepens because the war is protracted. So whereas in 1995 the intervention lasts about 48 hours, when NATO intervenes again in 99, they're expecting something quite similar. So they're expecting, a relatively brief intervention. Then the Serb government, then Milosevic, would basically come back to the negotiating table, sign the treaty, and the war would end. The problem is he doesn't, and the war drags on. And I mean, first of all, Milosevic sort of miscalculates anyway. He believes that NATO won't intervene, so he's sort of surprised when they do. But when the conflict starts, as I say, the war drags on, and it lasts about 11 weeks, which, for a war does not sound like a long time, but it's much, much longer than they were sort of expecting. The NATO was expecting, a relatively sort of brief, intervention, and a quick victory. When that doesn't happen, when that doesn't materialize, then the sort of crisis deepens. Various other reasons why they run into problems as well. First of all, NATO launches the mission to try and sort of limit the sort of humanitarian crisis that was unfolding in Kosovo. The trouble is, NATO basically intervenes through a bombing campaign, which does virtually nothing to stop the fact that Serb military forces are killing Kosovo civilians, driving them from their homes. You see a lot of ethnic cleansing and things like that. So the operation itself, to begin with, doesn't really stop the humanitarian crisis in Kosovo. There's also divisions about how the war should be fought. Bill Clinton, the American president, says that the operation has to be limited to an air campaign. So Clinton, as I say, this is 5 or 6 points down, but yeah, Clinton basically rules out using ground forces. So Clinton says, I'm not going to send soldiers into Kosovo, into Yugoslavia. So Clinton makes it clear he does not want to fight a ground campaign in Kosovo. He wants to limit the intervention to an air campaign, to dropping bombs on Yugoslav targets. As the war progresses, though, other countries, notably the British, become increasingly come to the view, basically, that it might well be necessary to send soldiers. So there's a sort of division opens up between the British and the Americans on whether or not sent into Kosovo. They also made the point the objectives of the operation weren't very clearly defined. So, having started the war, it wasn't quite clear exactly what they wanted to achieve. But we're sort of, sorry, I'm just reminding myself what something. Yeah, okay. Ultimately, though, as I say, there are divisions. There is a sort of mounting crisis, but eventually, as I say, the final point there, Milosevic capitulates. So eventually Milosevic finally brings the war to an end. partly as a result of European, American, and Russian diplomatic pressure. I think the Russians basically tell Milosevic, if this war goes on for much longer, then almost inevitably, the Americans and the Europeans will send in soldiers. So Milosevic ultimately is persuaded to sort of bring the war to an end, which causes a major political crisis for him in Serbia itself. Shortly after the war comes to an end, that Milosevic is finally removed from power in Serbia. Okay, the lessons from the intervention. So what did it sort of tell us about the state of NATO? First of all, you've got the issue of burden sharing, and we'll come back to that. We talked about burden sharing before, and that basically is the relative contributions that the Europeans and the Americans were making to the operation. And one of the things that kind of comes clear from the Kosovo campaign is that NATO was very, very heavily dependent on American military capabilities. So I say that US contributed vast majority of the firepower. So of the sort of bombing raids, about 90% of it was done by the Americans. So that was something that was made very clear from the from the military campaign. On the other hand, 13 European countries do contribute military forces to the operation, but as I say, in comparison to the contribution that the Americans made, this is fairly small. Sort of reveals the limits of the Europeans' capabilities. So it becomes clear that not many European countries have the capacity to contribute to an operation of this kind. And at the end of it, NATO sort of concludes that it does have to have an expeditionary capability, some sort of out-of-area capability, that it needs to be able to deploy military forces abroad, outside the NATO area. And then, the penultimate point on this thing is targeting was a problem. So it's choosing which targets NATO was actually going to bomb. I think the American military in particular resents the fact that the Europeans, through NATO, have so much influence when it comes to choosing what NATO, what American aircraft effectively were allowed to bomb and what they weren't. Although, again, Sperling and Weber basically makes the point that actually this might have been an exaggeration, and that the Europeans' role when it comes to targeting, it was basically one or two European countries in consultation with the United States. So, the French and the British, maybe the Germans, were playing the main role in when it came to choosing, what targets to hit. Basically, though, the argument was that the Europeans would play a sort of moderating role, effectively telling the Americans that no, you can't just put bombs all over Belgrade or whatever. Politically, that's just not going to be acceptable. So the conclusion of Sperling and Weber's article on this is that they think that the crisis aspect of the war is sort of exaggerated, and ultimately they say that NATO kind of achieves what it wants. It basically ultimately sort of prevails. It ultimately forces Milosevic to sign a peace agreement in which Kosovo does become a sort of autonomous province. And today, of course, Kosovo has basically, more or less anyway, become an independent state, not universally recognized, but so essentially, NATO does, despite the political divisions and the debates about how the war should be fought and all the rest of it, NATO basically holds together and sort of prevails. So Sperling and Weber say, NATO certainly doesn't experience the worst possible outcome. Ultimately, yeah, as I say, despite the problems, the organisation more or less kind of achieves a success. Okay, so that's Kosovo. Let's turn our attention to Afghanistan. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten I had another slide. I think this is what I just said. You know, despite the crisis, NATO doesn't fragment, so you know it doesn't fall apart. Avoided the worst outcome, you know, so ending the war without achieving its political objectives, which I just mentioned. But yeah, the war ends. There is some uncertainty about NATO's role beyond Europe. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, there is a sort of division, some sort of greater out of area Middle East. As I said, the Europeans, or many Europeans, sort of wanting to keep NATO primarily a sort of European security organization. The Americans, on the other hand, wanting to sort of extend NATO's remit. Okay, right. Let's get on to Afghanistan, and a little picture, a little cartoon here. And in this cartoon, we've got a small group of countries at the back, kind of pulling Afghanistan out of the fire. These being the United States. The second soldier behind the US soldier is Canadian, judging by the flag. Then the UK and the Netherlands. And then we've got 4 other soldiers lying on sunbeds, half asleep. And yes, we got the words nay pointing at these soldiers on the sunbeds. Nay in this case meaning sort of no. Okay. And tow, well, to tow, I can't remember what that is in Polish. But anyway, yeah, a car tows a caravan, or you know, so pulling something along, basically. And yes, so basically, yeah, the cartoon is kind of emphasizing the controversy over burden sharing, essentially saying some countries are doing most of the work in Afghanistan and some countries not so much. So Germany, France, Italy, Spain, you know, not really. And we will come back to this point in a moment. So burden sharing was part of the controversy in Afghanistan. Okay, Afghanistan and the war on terror. So obviously the Americans intervene in Afghanistan a few weeks after the 9/11 attacks. The reason for that, of course, being that Al-Qaeda, the organization, inflicted the attacks in New York and Washington on the 11th of September 2001, were based in Afghanistan at the time. The Americans demanded that the Afghan government, led by the Taliban in Afghanistan, they basically demanded that the Afghan government sort of hand over Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. And after some deliberation, the Afghan government decided that they weren't going to do that. And as a result of that, in October 2001, the Americans launched a military intervention. I say the Americans, it's a US-led intervention in Afghanistan, but several countries actually participate, including Britain, Italy, Germany as well. What is notable, though, and so obviously this comes about 2 years after. This comes about 2 years after the experience of Kosovo. What is notable, first of all, is that the military operation, the intervention in Afghanistan, was not a NATO operation. So the United States does not use NATO institutions, if I can put it that way, when it comes to this policy. This, despite the fact that on the 12th of September, so the day after 9/11, NATO does actually invoke Article 5. So NATO does basically formally say that the United States has been attacked and therefore NATO is now at war to defend the United States. So despite the fact that NATO has invoked this article, when the US does intervene in Afghanistan, as I say, it's not a NATO operation per se. So although some NATO members participate, it's not NATO which is actually running the show. And this is a very conscious decision on the part of the Americans. They basically decide that at this time they are not going to allow other NATO members to actually have any sort of decision-making role when it comes to strategy. So basically, the Americans want to sort of limit the amount of influence the Europeans have. Obviously, the intervention initially is pretty successful. So the Americans sort of march in, or coalition forces sort of march into Afghanistan. It should also be said they sort of work with anti-Taliban Afghan forces as well, a group organization known as the Northern Alliance. So they work with them, and yeah, the government in Kabul, the Afghan capital, is sort of overthrown. Taliban, sorry, Al-Qaeda. Bases in Afghanistan are overrun. So as I say, initially the operation seems to be reasonably successful. And again, I remember the period quite well. I mean, we talk about 2002, 2003. Obviously, in this period as well, the United States is preparing to launch a war against Iraq, which is much, much more controversial than the intervention in Afghanistan. And yeah, certainly after 2003, 2004, a lot of comparisons are made in terms of how the war has been fought in Afghanistan and how the war has been fought in Iraq. And yeah, initially at least, it seems that Afghanistan is the war that seems to be more successful in terms of how the military forces in the country are dealing with the situation. The final point on this slide is that, NATO eventually takes command of the international, I'm trying to remember what it stands for now. Yeah, the International Security Assistance Force. So this is the sort of peacekeeping force which is deployed in Afghanistan. So although NATO is not part of the initial intervention, ultimately the organization, ultimately NATO does sort of take control of the various military forces in Afghanistan. So ultimately Afghanistan does sort of become a NATO area of concern, if I can put it that way. Okay, as we mentioned before, going back to our little picture, which sort of highlights the problem of burden sharing, this idea that some countries were having to do much more of the work than others. And yeah, the Sperling and Webber's article goes into this in some detail. First of all, again, Operation Enduring Freedom. So this is the, I said it was a NATO-led. Again, I think that's a mistake, right? It wasn't a NATO-led operation. Okay, Operation Enduring Freedom. Okay, is the intervention in Afghanistan, and again, it sort of reveals the fact that the United States sort of contributes 68% of the sort of military forces to this operation. And that leads to this idea that there's a sort of clear imbalance between American and European contributions. And, the Americans are sort of complaining that again, they are having to do too much of the work. The article, though, the Sperling and Webber article, kind of basically makes the point, though, that when you put Afghanistan in a wider context, the various contributions of the Europeans and the Americans don't seem quite so imbalanced. So, leaving aside Afghanistan, you look at various other sort of NATO, American, European peacekeeping operations in other parts of the world at that time. And they make the point that actually the Europeans were contributing quite a lot of military forces elsewhere. So, for example, the Europeans contributed 88% of the forces to KFOR. This is the Kosovo force, so the sort of peacekeeping force which is deployed in Kosovo after the war there comes to an end in 1999. And actually, Kosovo basically becomes sort of part of the European Union's responsibilities. So although the Americans sort of lead the way in the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, ultimately, when it comes to the kind of peacekeeping efforts and the reconstruction of the country, that it's the Europeans who mainly take over responsibility for that. Then also makes the point that the European and American contributions in terms of men on the ground to ISAF, this is again the International Security and Assistance Force in Afghanistan, were roughly the same. So although the US plays the leading role in the intervention in Afghanistan, in terms of again peacekeeping operations and all of it, the European and American contribution was roughly as proportional. On the other hand, though, not all European countries contribute equally. So again, going back to our cartoon a couple of slides ago, it makes the point that the European countries most involved, certainly the British, also mentions the Dutch there. These countries playing a leading role there, whereas other countries more reluctant to actually bear the burden. So, as I say, Europe's contribution was not evenly spread around. Some European countries contributed more to sort of peacekeeping efforts in Afghanistan than others. But then makes the point, again, the article makes the point that the financial contributions of the Americans and the Europeans to Afghanistan were, again, roughly proportionate. So, it's not strictly true that, there was a clear imbalance in terms of European and American involvement. So basically, the Sperling and Webber articles say that the burden sharing question in Afghanistan, that has been exaggerated. It's not strictly true to say the Americans were doing much more of the work than the Europeans. As I say, if you put it in a wider context, as I say, Europeans more involved in other areas of the world. And when it comes to peacekeeping duties and things like that, the contributions were relatively even. On the other hand, again, that has to sort of be qualified. In terms of peacekeeping duties, the risk in Afghanistan was not evenly distributed. So again, we go back to the point that some European countries were doing more work than others. Some countries were unwilling to allow troops to be deployed in the more dangerous areas. So whereas, most European or most NATO members were allowed to were willing to send at least some troops to Afghanistan. As I say, there were some areas of Afghanistan which were much more dangerous than others. So some European countries were saying, we'll send our troops to this particular region, but we're not going to, we're going to be rather less willing to see them deployed in areas where, NATO forces were basically having to do a lot of fighting against the Taliban or Al-Qaeda elements, areas like that. Furthermore, some countries insist on what were known as caveats. Okay, I'll let you check that word. But basically, that put on restrictions on the types of operations their soldiers could undertake. So again, some countries said, we are willing to send soldiers, but we don't want them to be involved in combat operations. So again, some countries were wanting to try and minimize the sort of risks that their countries were willing to. So again, the level of risk was certainly not distributed. And again, I remember listening to somebody talking about this a few years ago. And he again was a sort of NATO expert, and he made the point that basically what was happening was that some countries' soldiers were dying and some countries weren't, and that sort of reflected the fact that not all countries were sort of equally committed to what was happening there. Okay, right, moving on. We're running out of time, so we'll bring this to a conclusion. But finally, okay, the Sperling and Weber article doesn't talk about Libya, but I think we should mention it because, again, I think that was the last really significant sort of NATO intervention. This takes place in 2011. And as the map shows here, on this occasion, the Europeans are very much involved in terms of the various operations. So it sort of lists the various countries. It says no-fly zone enforcement. So basically a no-fly zone was imposed upon Libya. Probably, I think, the pink area, it doesn't make it clear in terms of the map key, but I think the area in pink around Libya was basically the no-fly zone. And a number of countries sort of contributing to the mission here. So we've got Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Italy, Qatar. Interesting. Norway, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, and the Americans. And you can see, various sort of bases. So quite a few in France. So these are obviously French military forces, including one on Corsica, the French Mediterranean island. Another French base, it looks like, or at least French aircraft flying out of. Oh no, it's Canadian. I thought it was French. No, it's a Canadian forces coming out of Sicily. Then you got British bases, and again the British also having bases on Cyprus. Cyprus being a former British colony. Also in Italy as well, it looks like, British base. Okay. So anyway, the general point is that, the Europeans are playing quite a prominent role. And a couple of things I would say about that. First of all, when you look at the sort of diplomacy, obviously Libya becomes a sort of crisis point as a result of the Arab Spring, which sort of erupts across North Africa and the Middle East in 2010, end of 2010. In the case of Libya basically sort of descends into a civil war. And there were fears, sort of spring 2011, that Libya's leader, Colonel Gaddafi, would perhaps, but Gaddafi was preparing to launch a sort of military strike against rebel forces, and especially the Libyan city of Benghazi, which was basically a rebel stronghold. If you look on the map, it's on the coast in the eastern part of Libya. There were fears that Benghazi, which was a rebel stronghold, that Gaddafi would send, his forces to Benghazi, and that it would result in a sort of bloodbath, sort of military, humanitarian disaster. What's interesting about the Libyan intervention, though, is that this time it is the European, unlike in unlike in Bosnia and Kosovo, it's very much the Libyans. It's very much the Europeans who are playing the leading role in the intervention, and especially the British and the French governments. Again, I remember this pretty well, but David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, and President Sarkozy were right at the forefront in terms of managing this crisis. In contrast, President Obama, as of there, the Obama administration was content to lead from behind. So in other words, the Obama administration was willing to allow the Europeans to really, I suppose, spearhead the diplomatic and military efforts. the Libyan intervention in 2011, the United Nations did authorize the use of force on the basis of responsibility to protect. So the Chinese and the Russians did not actually veto a Security Council resolution. Should be said that the Russian leader at that time was President Medvedev. So it was not Putin who was notionally in charge of Russia, although Putin, of course, was prime minister and still playing a leading role. But anyway, Medvedev decides that Russia is not going to block a Security Council resolution, something that I think Putin subsequently comes to regret, or he feels that Medvedev made the wrong decision there, which has sort of consequences in terms of NATO's relations with Russia, but we'll talk about that another time. UN passes a resolution and a no-fly zone is imposed on Libya. So basically, again, launches an air campaign to prevent the Libyan government, to prevent Colonel Gaddafi from using Libyan aircraft to strike against rebel positions. Well, again, what is interesting about the Libyan intervention is that, again, not all NATO countries decide to participate. So some countries choose to not become involved, notably Germany on this occasion. So whereas in 1999, German aircraft had been involved in the bombing campaign against Kosovo. I think Kosovo is the first time German military forces had gone into combat since the Second World War. But in 2011, Chancellor Merkel decides that Germany will not actually contribute military forces to this. Poland as well. Again, I've written an article about this, but Poland also chooses not to participate in this particular NATO operation. Ultimately, though, NATO does support the Libyan rebel ground forces, which results in regime change. So ultimately, Gaddafi's government is overthrown. A few weeks later, Gaddafi himself is then captured and then quite brutally murdered. And the images were sort of captured by television. So Gaddafi himself sort of comes to a pretty nasty end. And again, that's quite significant in terms. I've talked a little bit about this in the last class when we talked a little bit about nuclear proliferation. I think one of the lessons other sort of authoritarian leaders draw from this is that it might not be such a bad idea to develop and then maintain nuclear weapons, because that will almost certainly make some sort of Western intervention rather more unlikely. So, the North Korean government sort of look at what happens to Gaddafi, and I think the likes of Kim Il-jong conclude that actually, it would be a good idea to develop some kind of nuclear capability. Again, not dissimilar to Afghanistan, I think, in 2001. Initially, the NATO campaign seems to go pretty well. So, Gaddafi is overthrown, the new government comes to power. But as in the case of Afghanistan and also in the case of Iraq, having overthrown the regime, the post-war efforts then start to go badly wrong. And I did a quick Google Scholar search yesterday to look at sort of academic publications about Libya, and it's quite striking that the first academic papers to be published about Libya, which appeared about 2011 and 2012, were saying, this is a really good example of how to organize a military intervention. But after 2013, 2014, most assessments, most academic assessments seem to regard Libya as having been something of a failure. So Libya basically sort of slips into a pretty nasty civil war, which is still ongoing. So today, I think, most people sort of concluded that Libya was a sort of failed intervention. That although it seemed to go pretty well at the time, in terms of the consequences for Libya, it's led to civil war, unrest, political instability, to the point at which Libya has come pretty close to being a failed state. It also, of course, contributed to the migration crisis that Europe experiences a year or two later. Unsurprisingly, lots of Libyan people just want to leave the country, escape to Europe, so cross the Mediterranean. So, the intervention does have significant consequences for Europe as well. Okay, right, I'll finish off here. In conclusion, then, throughout history, as I say, NATO has faced sort of multiple crises, or at least people have sort of argued that NATO has experienced crises. The argument that Sperling and Weber makes, though, is that in the case of Kosovo and Afghanistan, NATO did actually respond quite effectively. Kosovo, I think, can be regarded as being a sort of qualified, successful NATO. So, as I said, NATO itself doesn't kind of collapse during the Kosovo War. Ultimately, an independent Kosovo is sort of established. So, kind of NATO manages to achieve most of what it wants in terms of the intervention in Kosovo. NATO does take over the peacekeeping duties in Afghanistan. Yes, there are sort of divisions to contribute and what sort of operations to take. Today, though, I think I checked earlier. I think in 2000, I forget the year now. But anyway, I mean, the NATO operation in the NATO peacekeeping operation in Afghanistan basically comes to a conclusion. I think it's 2014, but I'd have to check that. I've forgotten. But I think in 2014, the NATO operations in Afghanistan sort of comes to a conclusion. And a decision is taken that the Afghan government is going to be primarily responsible for security in Afghanistan. So today, most NATO forces have actually been withdrawn from Afghanistan. But again, like Libya, Afghanistan's political future is very, very uncertain. So it's hard to conclude that the operation in Afghanistan has been particularly successful. I mean, the operation was not just to clear out Al-Qaeda, but also to create a functioning Afghan state. That hasn't really materialized. And in fact, President Trump has actually been negotiating with the Taliban some kind of peace agreement. So essentially saying that the United States would be willing to allow the Taliban to have some kind of involvement in Afghanistan's government in the future. So again, hard to view that as much of a success. Similarly, put Libya there, but you could say something similar about Libya. That the initial intervention goes well, but ultimately it sort of creates political chaos. So I would say, to put it kindly, I think you'd have to say that NATO has had something of a mixed record in recent years when it's come to sort of military intervention. Should also say, I mean, the relative failure in Afghanistan, the relative failure in Libya also sort of contributes, and Afghanistan as well for that matter, but the relative failures in Afghanistan and Libya also contribute to the Obama administration's reluctance to intervene in Syria. We're faced with the question of whether or not the United States should intervene, again, to sort of try and improve the kind of humanitarian crisis that was happening in Syria. When it came to it, the Obama administration was not willing to send significant military forces into Syria. And again, I think that was very much experiences Afghanistan and in Libya. Okay, and I will sort of conclude on that point.